The candle in Nora Finch's hand trembled, and she hated herself for it. She had rehearsed this moment 40 times in the cramped attic room above the village bakery, where she had slept for the past 3 months. She had pictured every step, down the servants' corridor after the last bell, past the kitchen where cook left the embers dying, through the narrow passage behind the tapestry that connected the east wing to the main house, and finally into the one room every maid, footman, and stable boy at Blackwood Estate had been told never to enter alone, the Duke's private study. Nora pressed her back against the heavy oak door and listened. The grandfather clock at the end of the hallway struck 11:30. The house was asleep. Even the housekeeper, Mrs. Calder, who seemed to have ears sharper than a hunting dog, had retired an hour ago after her nightly inspection of the silver. Nora turned the brass handle. The door gave way without a sound. Someone kept the hinges oiled, which told her something useful about the man who owned this room. He came and went quietly. He did not want to be heard. She stepped inside. The study smelled of old leather, lamp oil, and something faintly metallic. Moonlight came through the tall window behind the mahogany desk and through pale squares across the carpet. Bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with thick volumes bound in dark cloth. A globe stood in one corner, its surface covered in tiny handwritten notes. And there, spread across the wide desk, like a merchant's most prized cloth, were the drawings. Nora's breath caught. She would have recognized those lines anywhere, the precise, slanting strokes, the way the measurements were written in fractions rather than decimals, because her father had always said, fractions told you more about how a thing was built. The small circle he drew at every junction point, a habit he picked up from his own master engineer in Sheffield 30 years ago. These were her father's blueprints, his life's work. The design for a twin-cylinder steam pump that could drain a flooded mineshaft in half the time of any existing machine. He had spent 11 years perfecting it in their workshop behind their cottage in Hertfordshire, working by lamplight after his shifts at the local foundry, filling journal after journal with calculations and corrections. And then, 8 months ago, the journals and the master drawings had vanished from his workshop. 3 weeks after that, her father had died. The doctor called it a failure of the heart. Nora called it a broken one. She set the candle on the corner of the desk and leaned over the blueprints. Her fingers hovered above the paper, close enough to feel the slight roughness of the ink. She needed to find the original signature page. If she could prove these drawings carried her father's name, she could take them to the patent office in London and file a claim before anyone else did. She was so focused on the papers that she almost missed the second detail. Almost. Nora frowned. She tilted her head and pulled the candle closer. There, on the 3rd sheet, someone had redrawn the pressure valve assembly. The new lines were confident, but wrong. Whoever had copied this section had reversed the intake and exhaust channels. If a foundry built this valve exactly as drawn, the first full test would send the pressure gauge past its limit within 4 minutes. The boiler casing would crack. The pump would destroy itself. Find what you were looking for? The voice came from behind her, low and unhurried, like a man commenting on the weather. Nora spun around. Her elbow knocked the candle, and hot wax splashed across the desk. A man stood in the doorway of a side chamber she had not noticed, a small adjoining room hidden behind a panel in the bookshelf. He wore no jacket, just a white linen shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and dark trousers. His hair was the color of ink, slightly disheveled, and his jaw carried the shadow of a full day without a razor. He looked like he had been working late, and he looked entirely unsurprised to find a housemaid standing over his private documents. Duke Aldrich Vance. Nora had seen him only once before, that morning, when she had arrived at the servants' entrance with her forged letter of reference. He had been crossing the courtyard with his steward, a tall figure in a long gray coat, paying no attention to the new girl carrying a canvas bag. She had counted on that invisibility. Maids were furniture in houses like these, seen and never studied. "Your Grace," Nora said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I can explain." "I doubt that." Vance walked into the room and stopped on the other side of the desk. He looked at the blueprints, then at her, then at the blueprints again. "You have been in my household for exactly 14 hours. Most new maids wait at least a week before they start rifling through locked rooms. The door was not locked. I know. I left it open on purpose." He folded his arms. "Mrs. Calder told me you asked 3 questions about this study within your first hour. Which rooms were cleaned on which days? Who held the keys? Whether the Duke was in residence or in London." He paused. "You are either a very poor thief or a very determined one." Nora felt the ground shift beneath her. He had been expecting her. The oiled hinges, the unlocked door, the side chamber where he sat waiting in the dark. This was a trap, and she had walked straight into it. She had 2 choices: beg for mercy and be thrown out before dawn, losing her only chance to recover the blueprints, or tell him the truth and hope that a duke who kept stolen plans on his desk had enough guilt in him to listen. Nora chose a third option. She pointed at the 3rd blueprint sheet. "Your pressure valve is drawn backwards. The intake feeds into the exhaust manifold, and the exhaust vents into the intake chamber. If your foundry builds it this way, you will blow the boiler apart on the first full trial." Vance stared at her. "Also," Nora continued, because she had already decided that if she was going to be dismissed, she might as well be dismissed completely. "The piston ring tolerances on sheet 5 are too wide by nearly a 1/16 of an inch. Your cylinders will leak steam before they reach full compression. And whoever redrew the governor mechanism on sheet 7 does not understand centrifugal force, because the flyweights are mounted at the wrong radius." The study went very quiet. Vance unfolded his arms. He looked down at the 3rd sheet, then walked around the desk to stand beside her. He smelled of machine oil and sandalwood. He studied the drawing for a long moment, his dark eyes tracking the lines she had pointed to. "You are not a maid," he said. "I am, as of this morning. You know what these drawings are. I know exactly what they are. They are a twin-cylinder compound steam pump, designed for deep mine drainage. And they belonged to my father, Thomas Finch, before someone stole them from his workshop and sold them to you." She watched his face for guilt, for anger, for the cold dismissal she expected from a man of his rank. What she saw instead was something she had not anticipated: recognition. And then, strangely, something close to relief. "I purchased these designs 4 months ago," Vance said slowly, "from an anonymous broker through a London solicitor. I was told they came from a retired engineer who had no heirs and no interest in filing a patent. I paid £600 for them. My father was not retired. He was robbed, and he did have an heir." Nora straightened her shoulders. "Me." Vance studied her for a long moment. Then he did the last thing she ever expected. "Miss Finch," he said, "I would like you to marry me." Nora blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The Royal Patent Office requires that any submission for a Class 1 industrial patent be made by the inventor or their immediate household. I am not an engineer. I cannot answer the technical questions the examiners will ask. I need someone who understands every line of these drawings standing beside me when I present them. And apparently, that person is the woman who just broke into my study on her first night as a housemaid. That is the most absurd thing anyone has ever said to me. I imagine it is, but I am entirely serious." Nora looked at the blueprints spread across the desk. Her father's handwriting, her father's dreams, laid out in ink and precision on another man's table. She had come here to steal back what was taken. She had never imagined that the man who held it would ask her to stay. Nora spent 2 days arguing with herself before she agreed. She sat in the narrow servants' room she had been given on the top floor of Blackwood Estate, turning the decision over and over like a coin she could not read. Every sensible bone in her body told her to refuse. A duke does not marry a maid. A man does not propose to a woman he caught trespassing in his study. The whole arrangement had the shape of something crooked, and Nora had learned from her father that crooked things always broke under pressure. But every time she nearly talked herself out of it, she thought of the blueprints. If she walked away, Vance would find another engineer to fix the errors. He would file the patent under his own name. Her father's work would belong to a stranger forever, and Thomas Finch would be remembered as nothing more than a foundry worker who died poor in a Hertfordshire cottage. Nora could not stomach that. She could not let it stand. So on the morning of the 3rd day, she found Vance in the breakfast room and told him she accepted his terms, with conditions. The marriage would be a legal arrangement only. She would have full access to the blueprints and every document related to the patent. And when the patent was granted, her father's name would appear on the filing as the original inventor. Vance agreed to all 3 without argument, which made Nora trust him even less. By noon, her small canvas bag was packed and loaded onto the rear of Vance's traveling carriage. Mrs. Calder watched from the kitchen doorway with an expression that suggested she had seen many strange things in 30 years of service. But this one might be the strangest. The other servants whispered behind doors. Nora ignored them all. The carriage pulled away from Blackwood Estate under a grey October sky, heading south toward London. It was a 2-day journey on the turnpike roads, with a stop overnight at a coaching inn near St. Albans. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. Nora sat on one side of the carriage, her hands folded in her lap, watching the Hertfordshire countryside slide past the window, rolling fields, low stone walls, sheep dotting the hillsides like scattered cotton. Vance sat across from her, one ankle resting on the opposite knee, reading a small leather-bound book that he did not seem to be actually reading, because he had not turned a single page. The silence was the kind that pressed against the walls. Finally, Vance closed the book. "You think I am a thief." Nora kept her eyes on the window. "I think you are sitting in a very fine carriage that was paid for with other people's work. Whether that makes you a thief or simply a duke, I have not yet decided." A faint sound escaped him. It might have been a laugh. Fair enough. He reached into the leather satchel beside him and pulled out a folded document. He held it out to her. Nora took it and opened it carefully. It was a letter, written on thick cream paper with a solicitor's letterhead from an office on Chancery Lane. The date was 6 months ago. "That is the original purchase agreement," Vance said. "Read the second paragraph." Nora read. The letter described a set of mechanical drawings offered for private sale by an unnamed party through the solicitor's firm. The designs were described as the original work of a retired provincial engineer who wished to sell his intellectual property before emigrating to the continent. The asking price was £500. Vance had paid £600, apparently because he had been too eager to negotiate. "I was told the inventor had no family," Vance said. "No apprentices, no one with a claim. The solicitor assured me the sale was clean. And you believed him." "I had no reason not to. The drawings were extraordinary. I had been looking for exactly this kind of design for over a year. I wanted to present something to the Royal Patent Office that could change how mines operated across the north of England. Drainage is the single greatest problem in deep shaft mining, and your father's pump solves it." Nora folded the letter and held it back out to him. "My father did not emigrate anywhere. He died in his bed 8 months ago, 3 weeks after everything was stolen from his workshop. Someone broke in through the back window while he was at the foundry. They took every journal, every drawing, every prototype sketch. When he came home and found it all gone, something went out of him. He stopped eating. He stopped talking. He sat in his chair by the cold fireplace, and he just faded away. She said it plainly, without decoration, because the facts were heavy enough on their own. Vance was quiet for a long time. The carriage swayed over a rough patch of road, and the leather springs creaked beneath them. "I am sorry," he said. "Truly. Sorry does not put his name on the patent." "No, it does not." Vance leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "But consider this. Whoever sold me those drawings went through a great deal of effort to hide their identity. An anonymous broker, a solicitor, bound by client privilege, a false story about a retiring engineer. This was not some village opportunist climbing through a window for quick money. This was planned. Someone knew exactly what your father had built, understood its value, and arranged the entire theft months in advance. Nora had already thought of this. She had thought of little else for the past 8 months. You think someone specific was behind it. I think we were both used, Miss Finch. Someone sold me stolen property and let me take the risk of filing a public patent claim. If the theft were ever discovered, I would be the one holding the evidence. The true culprit would be invisible. The carriage slowed as they passed through a small market town. Nora could hear the shouts of traders and the clatter of hooves on cobblestones outside. A church bell rang twice. She studied Vance's face. He met her gaze without flinching. There was something steady in his expression, a directness that did not match the scheming nobleman she had expected to find when she took the maid's position at Blackwood. "If you already suspected the sale was arranged," Nora said slowly, "why did you not look into it yourself?" "Because until 2 nights ago, I did not know there was anything to look into. I thought I had purchased legitimate work from a willing seller. You are the one who told me otherwise." He paused. "And you are the one who can prove it. You know your father's methods, his drafting style, his engineering signatures. Without you, I have a set of drawings I cannot fully understand, and a patent application I cannot defend. Without me, you have a dead man's daughter, with no money, no legal standing, and no way to challenge a sale that was conducted through proper solicitors." Nora hated that he was right. She hated it the way she hated a stuck gear, something jammed into place that would not move no matter how hard she pushed. "So we find the broker," she said. "We find the broker, and when we do, Miss Finch, we take back everything that was stolen. Your father's name, my investment, and whatever else this person has taken that we do not yet know about." Nora turned back to the window. The market town was behind them now, and the road stretched ahead through open farmland, long and straight and leading toward London, toward answers. She did not trust Duke Aldrich Vance. She was not sure she even liked him. But she believed, for the first time since her father's death, that she was no longer fighting alone, and that, for now, was enough. The London Inventors Guild occupied a crooked brick building on a narrow street behind Holborn, squeezed between a printer's shop and a warehouse that smelled permanently of turpentine. The front door was painted green, though most of the paint had peeled away years ago, and a brass plate beside the handle read, "Est. 1761. in letters so worn they were nearly invisible. Nora loved it immediately. Vance had secured temporary workshop space on the second floor through his membership, which apparently cost an annual fee that could have fed Nora's village for a month. The room they were given was long and low-ceilinged, with 2 workbenches running down the center, shelves crammed with jars of screws and bolts, and a window at the far end that let in just enough gray London light to work by. The air tasted of brass filings and coal dust, and every surface carried the faint vibration of machines operating somewhere in the building below. It reminded Nora so sharply of her father's workshop that she had to stand in the doorway for a moment and breathe. "The guild master said we could use anything on the open shelves," Vance said behind her. He set a wooden crate on the nearest bench. Inside were the rolled blueprints, a set of measuring calipers, and several blocks of soft pine for carving model components. He also said we should avoid the lathe in the corner. "Apparently the drive belt snaps without warning. My father had one just like it," Nora said. "He fixed the belt problem by threading a strip of leather through the center of the canvas. It keeps the tension even." She caught Vance looking at her with that expression she was starting to recognize. It appeared whenever she said something technical without thinking, as if he were recalculating something in his head. They had been in London for 10 days now. Nora was staying in the guest quarters of Vance's townhouse on a quiet square in Bloomsbury, in a room that was larger than the entire ground floor of her cottage in Hertfordshire. The arrangement was proper. Vance had introduced her to his small London household as his fiancée, and a lady's maid named Agnes had been assigned to help Nora dress and manage her wardrobe, which currently consisted of 2 plain dresses and a Sunday shawl. Agnes had opinions about this. Nora had ignored them. The first week had been consumed by paperwork. Vance had meetings with his solicitor about the patent application timeline. Nora had spent hours at the townhouse desk, writing out everything she could remember about her father's design process, his specific techniques, the order in which he developed each component. She filled 12 pages of notes before her hand cramped. Now the real work began. "The patent office examiners will want to see a functioning scale model," Vance said, unrolling the first blueprint across the bench. "Something that demonstrates the core principle of the twin-cylinder system. They do not need a full-sized machine, but they need proof the design works as drawn." Nora pulled the candle stand closer and leaned over the drawing. "My father built a quarter-scale model once. It ran off a small spirit lamp and could pump water from a basin on the floor to a tank on the shelf. He kept it in the workshop for demonstrations." "Was it taken with everything else?" "I assume so. It was gone when I searched the workshop after the funeral." Nora traced the outline of the main cylinder with her fingertip. "We can build another. The principle is straightforward. The difficulty is in the valve timing. Both cylinders have to fire in sequence, and the crossover point has to be precise, or the whole thing stalls." Vance removed his coat and hung it on a nail by the door. Underneath, he wore a plain waistcoat over his shirt, and he rolled his sleeves up, the same way he had the night Nora first saw him in the study. She noticed his hands. They were not the soft hands of a man who spent his life signing papers in drawing rooms. His knuckles were nicked, and there was a thin scar across his left palm that looked like an old burn from hot metal. "Tell me where to start," he said. Nora raised an eyebrow. She had expected him to sit in a chair and watch, the way wealthy patrons typically supervised the craftsmen they hired. She had not expected him to ask for instructions. "Can you use a file?" she asked, passively. "Then start shaping the cylinder housings from those pine blocks. I need 2 identical tubes, 3 inches in diameter, 5 inches tall, with walls no thicker than a 1/4 inch. Use the calipers to check every cut." Vance picked up a block of pine and the calipers and set to work without complaint. They worked through the morning in a rhythm that surprised Nora with how quickly it settled. She handled the fine metalwork, shaping tiny brass pistons and valve seats from stock pieces she found on the guild shelves. Vance carved and sanded the pine housings, checking his measurements against hers with the careful patience of a man who understood he was learning something. He asked questions when he did not understand a step, and he listened to the answers without interrupting or offering alternative suggestions, which Nora found remarkable in a man of any rank, let alone a duke. By midday, the skeleton of the model was taking shape on the bench. Two wooden cylinders sat side by side, connected at the base by a brass crossover pipe that Nora had bent and soldered herself using the guild's small forge in the basement. The piston rods were fashioned from steel wire, and the crankshaft was a piece of clock spring that Vance had found in a jar labeled "miscellaneous" on the top shelf. Nora held up the crankshaft and tested its flex. "This will do. The spring tension is close to what we need for the flywheel resistance." Vance wiped sawdust from his hands with a cloth and came to stand beside her. He studied the partially assembled model with a look that carried genuine admiration, directed not at Nora, but at the design itself. "Your father built this from nothing. No university training, no wealthy patron. Just a foundry worker with a lamp and a notebook. He always said the best engineers were the ones who had to fix things that broke, because they learned what mattered and what was just decoration." Nora set the crankshaft into its bracket and felt it click into place. He would have laughed at the idea of presenting this to the Royal Patent Office. He built it to help miners, not to impress lords. "Perhaps it can do both." Nora glanced at him. There was no arrogance in the statement. He said it the way someone might say that rain could water both a field and a garden at the same time. She tightened the bracket with a small spanner. "You bought these plans because you wanted to change how mines are drained. Why does a duke care about mining?" Vance was quiet for a moment. He picked up a brass offcut from the bench and turned it between his fingers. "My family owns 3 coal mines in Northumberland. Last winter, the deepest shaft at Thornfield Colliery flooded after a week of heavy rain. The existing pumps could not keep up. 42 men were trapped below the waterline for 9 hours before we could get them out." He set the brass piece down. "Every one of them survived, by luck more than anything else. I decided that the next time it happened, I wanted something better than luck." Nora studied his face for traces of performance. The practiced sincerity she had seen from gentlemen who made speeches about the poor at church, and then rode home in gilded carriages. She found none. 42 men, she said quietly. 42 men. And their families standing at the pit head in the rain, waiting. Nora turned back to the model. She picked up the second piston assembly and began fitting it into the right-hand cylinder. Her fingers moved with the sure, practiced ease of someone who had done this kind of work since she was old enough to hold a wrench. "Then we had better make sure this works," she said. The Greystock Iron Foundry stood at the edge of London's industrial district, like a cathedral built for fire. Its roof was a skeleton of iron beams and sooty glass panels, and its walls were blackened brick that had not seen their original color in decades. 3 chimneys rose from the back of the building, each one belching thick columns of smoke into the November sky, and the sound that came from inside was a low, continuous roar, as if the earth itself were being hammered into shape. Nora had grown up near foundries. Her father had worked in one for 23 years. She knew the heat, the noise, the sharp smell of molten iron and quenched steel. But Greystock was something else entirely. This was the largest private foundry in the south of England, and Vance had contracted it to build the full-scale prototype of the steam pump. They arrived by carriage just after 9 in the morning. Vance had arranged the visit through the foundry's owner, a stout, red-faced man named Hargraves, who met them at the main gate with a handshake that could have bent a horseshoe. He wore a leather apron over his waistcoat and had the permanently sunburned look of a man who spent his life standing near open furnaces. "Your Grace," Hargraves said, pumping Vance's hand. "The lads have been at it since dawn. We have the main cylinder cast and cooling, and the boiler plates are being rolled this morning." He glanced at Nora with the expression she was growing accustomed to, polite confusion. She was dressed in a simple gray wool dress with a practical bonnet, and she carried a leather folio under her arm containing her working copies of the blueprints. She looked nothing like what people expected a duke's fiancée to look like, and she had stopped caring about that somewhere around the 4th day in London. "Miss Finch will be overseeing the technical specifications," Vance said. "She speaks with my full authority on any matter related to the build." Hargraves blinked. He looked at Nora, then at Vance, then back at Nora. "Right you are, Your Grace." They walked through the foundry floor in single file, weaving between workstations where men in heavy aprons fed coal into furnaces and swung long-handled tongs over glowing crucibles. The heat hit Nora in waves as they moved deeper into the building. Sweat gathered along her collar within minutes. She kept the folio pressed tight against her side and watched everything. The main cylinder had been cast the previous day and was now sitting on a bed of sand near the far wall, slowly cooling. It was enormous. Nora had designed the full-scale version to stand 4 feet tall with a bore of 18 inches, and seeing it in iron rather than ink on paper made her chest tighten with something between pride and grief. Her father should have been here for this. "The boiler assembly is being put together in the North Bay," Hargraves said, leading them around the cylinder. "My head foreman, Mr. Crabbe, is managing that section personally." Crabbe was a lean, sharp-featured man, with close-set eyes and hands that were permanently stained dark from metalwork. He stood beside the partially assembled boiler with a clipboard, directing 2 apprentices who were riveting the curved plates together with heavy mallets. He acknowledged Vance with a curt nod and gave Nora no acknowledgement at all. "Mr. Crabbe," Nora said, opening her folio, "I would like to review the boiler specifications you are working from." Crabbe looked at her the way one might look at a horse that had suddenly attempted speech. "The specifications are the ones provided by His Grace's office, miss. We have been following them exactly. Then you will not mind if I compare them to the originals." Crabbe glanced at Hargraves, who glanced at Vance, who said nothing but gave a slight nod. Crabbe handed over his clipboard with visible reluctance. Nora laid the clipboard beside her own drawings on a nearby workbench and began comparing them line by line. The apprentices stopped riveting and watched. The foundry noise filled the silence. It took her less than 3 minutes to find it. "These pressure ratings are wrong," Nora said. She tapped the clipboard with her finger. "The boiler shell thickness listed here is 3/16 of an inch. The original specification calls for a 1/4 inch, and the safety valve on the crown sheet is rated for 60 pounds per square inch. The original design sets the maximum at 45. Crabbe's jaw tightened. 3/16 is standard for a boiler of this size, miss. Every foundry in England uses it. Every foundry in England is building single-cylinder engines with lower operating pressures. This is a twin-cylinder compound system. The internal pressures during the crossover phase are significantly higher than a standard engine. If you build the shell at 3/16 and set the safety valve at 60 pounds, the boiler will hold for perhaps a dozen full cycles before the stress fractures begin to spread through the riveted seams. Nora looked up from the clipboard. "And when a boiler fails at 60 pounds per square inch, Mr. Crabbe, it does not simply leak, it comes apart." The foundry seemed to grow quieter around them, though the furnaces still roared and the hammers still rang. The 2 apprentices stood very still. Hargraves had gone pale beneath his permanent sunburn. Crabbe said nothing for a long moment. His eyes moved from Nora to the partially assembled boiler behind him, where 2 full rows of rivets had already been driven into the thinner plates. "Those plates will need to be stripped and recast," Nora said. "The riveted sections cannot be salvaged. The holes are already spaced for 3/16 gauge, and a 1/4 inch plate will require wider spacing to maintain structural integrity." "That is 2 days of work wasted," Crabbe said through his teeth. 2 days of work is considerably less than what you would waste when your boiler tears itself apart in the middle of a demonstration for the patent office examiners. Nora closed the folio. The safety valve also needs to be rebuilt with a lower threshold. I can provide adjusted drawings this afternoon. She turned to Hargraves. I would also recommend checking every specification sheet Mr. Crabbe has been working from against the originals in my folio. If one set of numbers was altered, there may be others. Hargraves nodded slowly. He had the look of a man who had just watched the ground shift beneath a building he thought was solid. Vance had remained silent through the entire exchange. He stood a few paces back with his hands clasped behind him, watching. As Nora walked past him toward the foundry entrance, he fell into step beside her. "You knew," he said quietly, once they were out of earshot. "Before you even opened the clipboard. You knew something was wrong." "I suspected. The specifications Crabbe was working from were not the ones we sent from the guild workshop. Someone changed the numbers between our office and his workbench." "Crabbe himself?" "Possibly. Or someone who got to the documents before they reached him." Nora paused at the foundry gate and looked back at the building. Smoke poured from the chimneys against the flat gray sky. The changes were subtle, the kind of adjustments that would pass a casual inspection but guarantee failure under real operating conditions. Whoever did this understood enough about boiler mechanics to know exactly which numbers to change. Vance's expression darkened. Someone wants the prototype to fail. Someone wants it to fail spectacularly, in front of witnesses, so that the patent application is denied and the design is discredited. Nora met his gaze. This was not a foreman cutting corners to save time. This was deliberate sabotage. They stood in the foundry yard, the clatter and heat of the building behind them, the gray sprawl of London's industrial edge stretching away in every direction. Somewhere in this city, someone was watching their progress and working to destroy it. The stolen blueprints, the anonymous broker, and now this. The pieces were connecting, and the picture they formed was getting darker. "We need to find out who Crabbe answers to," Nora said. "Someone is paying him, and it is not Mr. Hargraves." Vance nodded. "I will have my solicitor look into Crabbe's affairs. Bank records, correspondence, associates. Do it quietly. If Crabbe knows we suspect him, whoever is behind this will simply find another way in." Vance looked at her for a moment. "You are remarkably calm for someone who just prevented an explosion." Nora tucked the folio under her arm. "My father always said that panic is a luxury engineers cannot afford. You feel it later, when the work is done." She climbed into the waiting carriage without looking back. Her hands, hidden in her lap where Vance could not see them, were shaking. Nora had never owned a dress that made a sound when she walked. The gown Agnes had laid out on her bed that afternoon was made of deep blue silk with a modest neckline trimmed in ivory lace. It had a fitted bodice, long sleeves that tapered at the wrist, and a full skirt that rustled against the floor with every step like wind through dry leaves. There were matching gloves that reached past her elbows and a pair of soft kidskin shoes that felt like wearing nothing at all. She stood in front of the tall mirror in her room at Vance's Mayfair residence and did not recognize herself. "Stop pulling at the waist," Agnes said from behind her, adjusting the last pin in Nora's hair, which had been swept up and arranged in a style that involved more pins than Nora thought a human head could hold. "It fits perfectly. You will wrinkle the silk. I look like someone pretending to be someone else." "You look like a duke's fiancé, miss, which is exactly what you are, at least for this evening." The ballroom downstairs was already filling with guests. Nora could hear the muffled hum of conversation and the tuning of stringed instruments drifting up through the floorboards. Vance had spent the past week organizing this event with the help of his London steward, a quietly efficient man named Phelps, who seemed capable of arranging anything from a formal dinner for 80 to the delivery of a grand piano at 4 hours' notice. The purpose of the ball was simple. Vance needed London society to accept Nora before the patent hearing, A duke marrying an unknown woman from Hertfordshire would raise enough eyebrows to fill a portrait gallery. If rumors and gossip reached the patent office examiners before the application was filed, questions would be asked. Awkward ones, the kind that could unravel everything. So tonight, Nora was to be introduced, admired, and accepted. She had to smile and make conversation with people who measured worth by acreage and bloodline. She had to hold a champagne glass she did not intend to drink from, and answer questions about her background without revealing that 3 weeks ago she had been scrubbing floors for a living. She would rather have faced another faulty boiler. "Ready, miss?" Agnes asked. "Absolutely not," Nora said, and went downstairs. The ballroom was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, throwing warm light across polished oak floors and walls papered in cream and gold. An orchestra occupied one corner, playing something elegant that Nora did not know the name of. Dozens of guests filled the room, the men in dark evening coats and white cravats, the women in gowns of every color, their necks and wrists sparkling with jewels. Vance was waiting at the foot of the main staircase. He wore a black tailcoat with a dark gray waistcoat and a silk cravat tied in a knot that looked like it had taken someone 15 minutes to perfect. His hair was combed back, and he looked, Nora had to admit, entirely like a man who belonged in this room. He offered his arm without ceremony. "You look well, Miss Finch." "I look like a Christmas ornament. An expensive one, at least." He guided her into the room. "Stay close for the first hour. I will handle the introductions. You simply need to be pleasant. I am always pleasant. You once told my head footman that his method of polishing silverware was an offense against metallurgy. It was. He was using the wrong compound. The chloride in his polish was pitting the surface." Vance made a sound that she had learned to identify as a suppressed laugh. They moved through the crowd together, and Nora endured the introductions with more patience than she thought she possessed. Vance presented her to barons, viscounts, wealthy merchants, and their wives with smooth, practiced ease. Nora smiled, offered her hand, and repeated the story they had agreed upon. She was the daughter of a respected provincial engineer. She and Vance had met through mutual acquaintance at a scientific lecture in London. Their shared interest in industrial advancement had brought them together. It was close enough to the truth that Nora could say it without flinching, and far enough from it that she felt the lie sitting on her tongue like a stone. By the second hour, Nora had excused herself from Vance's side and found a quiet corner near the tall windows overlooking the garden. She needed air. The room was too warm, the conversations too layered with false politeness, and her shoes, despite their softness, were beginning to pinch. She was examining a painting on the wall, a dull landscape of some lord's country estate, when someone spoke beside her. "Remarkable piece. Though I always thought Ashworth painted trees as if he secretly despised them." Nora turned. The man standing next to her was perhaps 50, with silver hair swept back from a broad forehead and a neatly trimmed beard that gave him the look of a distinguished university professor. He wore an exceptionally well-cut coat of dark green velvet, and his cufflinks were gold, shaped like tiny mechanical gears. His smile was warm and immediate, the kind of smile that invited trust. "Lord Philip Sterling," he said, bowing slightly. "I do not believe we have been introduced, though I have heard a great deal about the Duke's remarkable fiancée." "Miss Nora Finch," she said. "And I would not believe everything you hear at parties, my lord." Sterling laughed. It was a generous laugh, easy and practiced. "Wise counsel. I understand you have an interest in engineering, quite unusual for a young woman of your circumstances." "My father was an engineer. I grew up in his workshop." "Ah, yes, Thomas Finch." Sterling said the name casually, the way one might mention having passed through a town once on a long journey. "A foundry man from Hertfordshire, if I recall correctly." Clever fellow. I believe he had a workshop behind his cottage, on the lane that runs past the old mill. Nora's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. She had not told Sterling her father's first name. She had not mentioned Hertfordshire. And she had certainly not described the location of the workshop. "You knew my father?" she asked, keeping her voice level. "Knew of him, rather. The engineering community in this country is smaller than people think. Word travels when someone produces interesting work." Sterling sipped his champagne with the ease of a man who drank it the way others drank water. "I was sorry to hear of his passing. Such a loss, and such a pity that his designs were never properly recognized during his lifetime." Every instinct Nora possessed was firing at once. This man knew too much. He knew her father's name, his location, the nature of his work, the fact that he had died. These were details that a casual acquaintance in the engineering world would not have. These were details that someone much closer to the story would carry. "His designs may yet receive the recognition they deserve," Nora said carefully. "Indeed. I hear the Duke is pursuing a patent application for a rather impressive steam pump." Sterling turned to face her fully, and for just a moment, the warmth in his expression shifted. Something colder moved behind his eyes, there and gone, like a fish passing beneath the surface of a still pond. "I do hope the provenance of the design is well documented. The patent office can be terribly particular about questions of original authorship." He held her gaze for a second longer than was comfortable, then smiled again, wide and warm. "Do enjoy the evening, Miss Finch, and please give my regards to the Duke." He walked away through the crowd, greeting other guests with the same easy charm, leaving Nora standing by the window with her heart beating hard against her ribs. She knew, with absolute certainty, the way she could look at a set of drawings and know whether a machine would hold or fail. Lord Philip Sterling was the anonymous broker. He had stolen her father's work, sold it to Vance through a solicitor on Chancery Lane, and now he was standing in this ballroom drinking champagne and smiling at her, daring her to prove it. Nora set her glass down on the nearest table and went to find Vance. They returned to Blackwood Estate at the end of the 5th week, and Nora carried Lord Sterling's name in her mind like a splinter lodged beneath the skin. She had told Vance everything the night of the ball, standing in the quiet of his study, while the music still played downstairs and the guests danced on the polished floors. Vance had listened without interrupting, his face growing still in the way she had come to understand meant he was thinking hard. When she finished, he asked 3 questions. What exactly had Sterling said? How had he said it? And what had his eyes done when he mentioned the patent office? Then he had said, "We go back to Blackwood. I need to think, and I think better away from London." The estate in late November was a different world from the one Nora had first entered as a housemaid. The trees along the main drive had shed their leaves, and the grounds were carpeted in damp brown and gold. Fog gathered in the low fields every morning and did not lift until noon. The house itself seemed to contract in the cold, its stone walls drawing inward, its fireplaces burning constantly to hold back the chill that crept through every window frame. Nora spent the first 3 days buried in work. She had brought the scale model from the guild workshop, now nearly complete, and she set it up in a small room off the library that Vance had cleared for her use. She adjusted the valve timing, replaced a cracked piston seal, and ran test after test, using a spirit lamp and a basin of water, measuring how many seconds it took to move a pint from the lower reservoir to the upper tank. The model worked. Every time she lit the lamp and watched the twin pistons begin their alternating rhythm, pushing and pulling in the sequence her father had calculated all those years ago in his cottage workshop, she felt something tighten in her throat. It worked because he had made it right. Because Thomas Finch, who had never set foot in a university or attended a single lecture at the Royal Society, had understood something about pressure and motion and timing that men with 10 times his advantages had missed. It worked, and he was not here to see it. On the fourth night, Nora could not sleep. She lay in her bed in the East Wing guest room, listening to the wind push against the old windows, and finally gave up at midnight. She pulled a shawl over her nightdress, lit a candle, and went downstairs. The conservatory was at the back of the house, a long glass-walled room that Vance's mother had built 30 years ago for growing orchids and citrus trees. Most of the plants had been neglected since her death, but a few stubborn survivors still clung to their pots, and the room retained a faint sweetness beneath the smell of cold earth and damp stone. Moonlight poured through the glass panels and turned everything silver. Nora sat on the iron bench beside the largest lemon tree and pulled her shawl tight. She had come here to think, but her thoughts kept circling the same ground like a horse on a mill wheel. Sterling knew everything. He knew her father's name, where he had lived, what he had built. He had stood in that ballroom and laid it all out in front of her with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. And perhaps he was. A lord with money, connections, and a solicitor who had hidden his identity behind layers of legal privilege. What did Nora have against that? A dead father's memory and a set of blueprints in another man's possession. She heard footsteps on the stone floor and looked up. Vance stood in the doorway of the conservatory, dressed in a heavy wool robe over his shirt, his feet in leather slippers. His hair was ungoverned, falling across his forehead, and he carried a glass of something amber that he set on the ledge beside the door. "I saw the light," he said. "Mrs. Calder would have a fit if she knew you were wandering the house at this hour. Mrs. Calder has a fit every time I enter a room. I think she still half expects me to steal the silverware." Vance sat on the opposite end of the bench. The iron frame creaked under his weight. Between them, the lemon tree's branches made sharp shadows on the tiled floor. "I spoke with my solicitor this morning," he said. "Quietly, by letter. I asked him to look into Lord Sterling's financial dealings over the past 2 years. Specifically, any transactions involving patent brokerage, mechanical designs, or anonymous sales through intermediary firms." Nora looked at him. "And?" He wrote back this afternoon. "Sterling has been connected to at least 3 other patent disputes in the past 5 years. Each time a design surfaced on the market through an anonymous seller, was purchased by a wealthy investor, and then Sterling appeared during the patent process to challenge the filing or offer to buy the patent outright at a fraction of its value. 2 of those disputes ended with the original inventor losing their claim entirely." The conservatory was very quiet. Somewhere outside, an owl called across the dark grounds. "He has done this before," Nora said. The words felt heavy. "Multiple times. He identifies valuable inventions created by men without the resources to protect their work. He arranges the theft, launders the sale through solicitors, and then positions himself to profit, regardless of the outcome. If the buyer succeeds with the patent, Sterling approaches them later with evidence of the theft and demands a share of the profits in exchange for silence. If the buyer fails, Sterling acquires the design himself at a discount, and no one has stopped him. No one has been able to prove it. The anonymous sales are conducted through different solicitors each time. The original inventors are always men like your father. Provincial, working class, without the money or the connections to fight a legal battle against a peer of the realm." Nora's hands were clenched in her lap. She could feel her nails pressing into her palms through the wool of her shawl. "He chose my father because he knew my father could not fight back. And when the theft destroyed him, Sterling felt nothing. He attended a ball and drank champagne." Vance was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she did not expect. "I intend to put your father's name on the patent." Nora turned to face him. "What?" "When we file the application with the Royal Patent Office, the primary inventor listed on the documents will be Thomas Finch. His name, his credit, his legacy. I will be listed as the commercial sponsor and manufacturing partner, nothing more. Your solicitor will tell you that is a poor business decision. My solicitor tells me many things. I employ him for his expertise, not his permission. Vance met her eyes. The moonlight through the glass panels caught the angles of his face and made him look older, more worn. I bought stolen property, Miss Finch. Whether I knew it or not at the time does not change what happened. Your father's work was taken from him, and it contributed to his death. I cannot undo that. But I can make certain that when this engine changes the mining industry, and it will, the world knows whose mind created it. Nora felt something shift inside her chest, a wall she had built carefully over months of grief and anger, a wall she had reinforced every day with suspicion and self-reliance, developed its first crack. Sterling will come for us, she said. He will not let the patent go through unchallenged. He has too much to lose. If we succeed, his entire method is exposed. I know. He has money. He has influence. And he clearly has people willing to do his work for him. The foreman at Greystock, the solicitor on Chancery Lane, whoever broke into my father's workshop. He will use every tool available to him. I know that too. Vance leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees, which is why we are going to prepare for him. Every document, every piece of evidence, every record of your father's original work. We gather it all, and we make it unassailable. When Sterling makes his move at the patent hearing, we will be ready. Nora studied him in the cold silver light of the conservatory. This man who had proposed marriage to a housemaid, who carved pine cylinders without complaint, who rolled his sleeves and asked where to start. She still was not sure she fully understood what drove him, whether it was guilt over the stolen designs, genuine belief in the engine, or something else she had not yet identified. But she was beginning to believe that whatever it was real. Then we had better start tomorrow, she said. Vance nodded. He picked up his glass from the ledge, stood, and paused at the doorway. For what it is worth, Miss Finch, your father raised a remarkable engineer. He left before she could respond, which was probably wise, because Nora was not sure she could have spoken just then without her voice breaking. She sat alone in the conservatory for a long time after that, watching the moonlight move across the glass, and for the first time since her father's death, the weight on her shoulders felt like something she could carry. Nora smelled the smoke before she heard the shouting. She had fallen asleep at the small desk in her workroom off the library, her head resting on a stack of her father's notes that she had been organizing into chronological order for the patent filing. The candle beside her had burned down to a stub, and the fire in the grate had gone to ash. The room was cold, and for a moment, when she opened her eyes, she thought the smell was just the last trace of the dying embers. Then she heard glass breaking somewhere outside. Nora stood so quickly, her chair tipped backwards and struck the floor. She went to the window and pulled back the curtain. The view from this side of the house faced the rear grounds, and beyond the kitchen garden and the stable yard, she could see the long stone building that served as the estate's carriage house. It was on fire. Orange light poured from the two high windows on the eastern wall. Smoke climbed into the night sky in a thick, dark column that the wind was already dragging sideways across the yard. As Nora watched, a tongue of flame licked out from beneath the wooden doors and curled upward along the frame. She grabbed her shawl and ran. The corridors of Blackwood Estate were dark and cold at this hour, and Nora nearly collided with a footman who was stumbling out of the servants' quarters in his nightshirt, still half asleep. She pushed past him without stopping, took the back stairs 2 at a time, and burst through the kitchen door into the yard. The heat reached her 20 paces from the carriage house. It pressed against her face like a flat iron, and the roar of the fire was louder than she had expected, a deep, hungry sound that swallowed every other noise. 2 stable boys were already there, hauling water from the pump in wooden buckets. But the flames had taken hold of the timber roof beams, and the water was doing little more than raising clouds of hissing steam. Vance appeared from the direction of the main house, coatless, his shirt untucked, his boots unlaced. He must have been awake when the fire started, because he arrived barely a minute after Nora, and he was already shouting instructions to the stable master, who was leading the frightened horses out of the adjacent stable block. "The document chest," Nora said, grabbing Vance's arm. "The master blueprints are in the carriage house vault." She saw the recognition hit his face. 3 days ago, on Vance's instruction, the original blueprints and all of Nora's supporting documentation had been moved from the house to the small iron vault built into the rear wall of the carriage house. Vance had considered it safer than keeping them in the main residence, reasoning that a stone outbuilding with an iron strongbox was less vulnerable than a wooden desk in a house full of fireplaces. That logic was burning to the ground in front of them. "Stay here," Vance said. "Do not be ridiculous." "Nora, stay here." It was the first time he had used her Christian name. She barely registered it, because he was already moving toward the carriage house doors. The left door had partially collapsed inward, and the gap was filled with rolling smoke that glowed orange from the fire behind it. The right door was still standing, but the wood was blackening, and the iron hinges were radiating heat that Nora could feel from where she stood. Vance pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth, kicked the right door hard enough to crack it off one hinge, and went inside. Nora counted the seconds. She stood in the yard with the heat beating against her and the smoke stinging her eyes, and she counted. 5 seconds. 10. 15. At 20 seconds, one of the roof beams let out a sound like a gunshot and dropped a shower of sparks through the broken windows. At 25 seconds, she started toward the door. At 28 seconds, Vance came out. He was dragging the iron document chest by one handle, bent nearly double, coughing so hard his whole body shook. His shirt was scorched across one shoulder, and his hair was gray with ash. Nora ran to him and grabbed the other handle, and together they hauled the chest across the cobblestones until they were clear of the building. Behind them, the rest of the roof gave way with a groan that sounded almost human, and the carriage house folded in on itself in a rush of flame and sparks that lit up the yard like daylight. Vance dropped to his knees on the cobblestones, still coughing. Nora knelt beside him and pulled his hands away from his face to check for burns. His palms were red and blistered where he had gripped the hot iron handle, and there was a mark across his left forearm where something had fallen on him inside. But his eyes were clear, and his breathing, though ragged, was steady. "You could have been finished," Nora said. "The documents," Vance managed between coughs. "Are they intact?" Nora turned to the chest. The iron was warm to the touch, almost too hot, but the lock was still secure, and the seams had held. She used the key from around her neck, the one Vance had given her when they stored the papers, and opened the lid. Inside, the blueprints and journals were untouched. The iron had done its job. "They are safe," she said. Vance sat back on the cobblestones and closed his eyes. The firelight played across his face, and for a moment he looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than smoke and exertion. The household was fully awake now. Mrs. Calder had organized a bucket chain from the kitchen pump, and the stable boys were dousing the walls of the adjacent buildings to keep the fire from spreading. The carriage house itself was beyond saving. It burned steadily, collapsing piece by piece, until only the stone walls remained standing around a heap of glowing timber and twisted metal. When the immediate crisis had passed and the fire was contained to the ruin of the carriage house, Nora walked back to the wreckage. The cobblestones around the building were littered with debris, charred wood, fragments of broken glass, nails twisted by the heat. She moved carefully through it, studying the ground the way her father had taught her to study a failed machine. "Look at what is there," Then look for what should not be there. She found it near the base of the eastern wall, half buried under a collapsed section of roof timber. A metal canister, roughly the size of a tea tin, blackened by the fire but still intact. Nora used a stick to push the timber aside and crouched down to examine it. The canister had a small opening at the top, sealed with a wax plug that had melted in the heat. Inside, she could see the remains of a cotton wick and a residue of something thick and dark that smelled sharply of naphtha. There was a short length of fuse cord attached to the base, burnt down to nothing, and a simple clockwork mechanism, barely more than a watch spring and a striker, that had been designed to light the fuse at a set time. It was crude but effective. Someone had built a timed incendiary device, placed it against the wall of the carriage house, and set it to ignite in the middle of the night. This fire was not an accident. It was not a stray spark from the stable or a lantern left burning. It was arson, planned and executed with the specific intention of destroying the contents of the vault. Nora carried the canister back to where Vance was sitting, on an overturned water trough, having his hands wrapped in damp cloth by one of the kitchen maids. She set the device on the ground in front of him. "Sterling," she said. Vance looked at the canister. He picked it up carefully, turning it in his bandaged hands, examining the clockwork mechanism with the same focused attention he gave to everything that mattered. "He sent someone," Vance said, "onto my estate, into my grounds, to burn evidence that would expose him. Which means he knows we are preparing for the patent hearing. He knows we have the originals, and he knows they can prove his forgery. He is getting desperate." Vance set the canister down. When he looked up at Nora, the exhaustion was still there in his face, but underneath it was something harder. Something that reminded her of iron being shaped in a forge, heated and hammered until it held an edge. "Then we move quickly," he said. "We file the patent application this week. We take every document to London ourselves, and we do not let them out of our sight until they are entered into the court record." Nora sat down beside him on the water trough. The fire was dying now, settling into a low glow that threw long shadows across the yard. Her hands were dirty with soot. Her nightdress was ruined, and she could still taste smoke at the back of her throat. "He will try again," she said. "Let him." Vance looked at the ruined carriage house, then at the iron chest, standing safe and whole on the cobblestones. "We have what we need, and now we have proof that he is willing to commit crimes to stop us. That is something a magistrate will find very interesting." Nora looked at Vance's bandaged hands. He had walked into a burning building to save her father's work. She could rationalize it as self-interest, as protecting his investment, as a duke preserving his property. She could tell herself any number of practical explanations. None of them accounted for the way he had said her name before he went through that door. She filed that thought away for later, in the part of her mind where she kept things that were too complicated to examine under firelight. "Come inside," she said. "Cook will have something for those burns. And we have a long week ahead of us." The High Court of Patents occupied the ground floor of a gray stone building on a narrow street behind Westminster Hall. It was not a grand courtroom. There was no public gallery, no vaulted ceiling, no oak paneling polished by centuries of legal argument. The room was functional and plain, with whitewashed walls, tall windows that let in thin winter light, and rows of wooden benches arranged in straight lines, facing the magistrate's raised desk. It smelled of old paper and candle wax, and the floor was so worn in places that the grain of the wood had risen into ridges that caught the soles of Nora's shoes as she walked to her seat. She had dressed carefully that morning. Agnes had helped her into a dark green wool dress, with a high collar and plain cuffs, something respectable and serious, that would not draw attention or invite comment. Nora had pinned her hair back tightly, close to her head, the way she wore it when she worked in the workshop. She wanted the magistrate to see someone precise, someone who measured things and got them right. Vance sat beside her on the front bench, dressed in a dark suit that fit him with the quiet authority of good tailoring. His hands were still marked from the fire, faint pink scars across both palms, and he kept them resting on his knees where the magistrate could see them if he chose to look. Beside Vance sat Mr. Aldworth, the solicitor who had been handling the patent application, a small, careful man with spectacles and a habit of tapping his pen against his thumb when he was thinking. The opposing bench was occupied by Lord Stirling and his legal counsel, a barrister named Huxley who had a reputation in patent law that preceded him through the door like a cold draught. Huxley was tall and angular, with a narrow face and a voice that carried across the room without effort. Stirling himself sat with his legs crossed and his hands folded in his lap, looking as comfortable as a man settling in for an afternoon at his club. Magistrate Thornbury entered at precisely 10 o'clock. He was a man of about 60, with a long, lined face and eyes that missed nothing. He sat down, arranged his papers, and opened the proceedings with a brief summary of the case. A patent application for a twin-cylinder compound steam pump filed by His Grace the Duke of Blackwood on behalf of the original inventor, the late Thomas Finch. A counterclaim filed by Lord Philip Stirling, asserting prior ownership of the design. Lord Stirling, Thornbury said, looking over his spectacles, "You may present your claim." Huxley rose and laid out Stirling's case with the smooth efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. His client, he explained, had commissioned the design of a twin-cylinder steam pump from an independent engineer in 1839, 2 full years before the date on Thomas Finch's earliest known drawings. He produced a set of blueprints bearing an earlier date stamp, along with a letter of commission allegedly signed by Stirling and countersigned by the unnamed engineer. The documents were neatly bound in a leather folder and presented to the magistrate with the confidence of evidence that expected to be believed. Nora sat very still. She had anticipated something like this. Stirling would not have come to court without paper to support his claim. Forged paper, certainly, but paper that would look convincing to a magistrate who was not an engineer. The dates on Stirling's blueprints were the key. If the magistrate accepted that Stirling's design predated her father's work, the patent would be denied, and Thomas Finch's name would disappear from the record entirely. Everything would have been for nothing. The months of work, the fire, the nights spent organizing evidence. All of it undone by a set of fabricated dates on counterfeit drawings. Thornbury examined the documents for several minutes. He turned the pages slowly, holding each sheet up to the light from the window as if checking for watermarks. Then he set them down and looked at the opposing bench. "Mr. Aldworth, do you wish to respond?" Aldworth stood. "Your Honor, we request that Miss Nora Finch, daughter of the late Thomas Finch and a qualified engineer in her own right, be permitted to examine the documents presented by Lord Stirling and offer testimony regarding their authenticity." Thornbury glanced at Stirling's bench. Huxley made a small dismissive gesture, the kind that suggested he considered the request a waste of time, but would not object. Stirling's expression did not change. "Miss Finch, please approach," Thornbury said. Nora rose. Her heart was beating faster than she would have liked, but her hands were steady. She had spent the last 3 weeks preparing for exactly this moment, reviewing every page of her father's work, memorizing his techniques, his habits, the tiny details that made his drawings unmistakably his. She walked to the magistrate's desk, and Thornbury handed her Stirling's blueprints. She studied the first sheet for a full minute without speaking. The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of a clerk's pen somewhere behind her and the distant sound of carriage wheels on the street outside. "This drawing was not made in 1839, Nora said. Huxley shifted in his seat. Stirling uncrossed his legs. The date stamp says 1839, Thornbury observed. The date stamp says many things, Your Honor. The drawing itself tells a different story. Nora laid the sheet flat on the magistrate's desk and pointed to the lower right corner. My father used a specific method of notation that he developed over his career. He wrote his dimensions in fractional form, always with the numerator above a horizontal line and the denominator below. He placed his reference marks at the junction points of every major component, using a small circle with a dot at the center. These are habits that remained consistent across 30 years of his work. I have brought examples of his authenticated drawings from as early as 1831 to demonstrate this. She placed 3 sheets from her own folio beside Sterling's blueprints. The magistrate leaned forward and compared them. The drawings Lord Sterling has presented use my father's notation style, Nora continued. The fractional dimensions, the junction circles, the specific angle of the measurement lines. Whoever produced these sheets had access to my father's original work and copied his methods carefully. They are very good copies. She paused. The room waited. But there is one detail the copyist did not know about. Nora turned Sterling's blueprint over. On the reverse side of the paper, in the lower left corner, she pointed to a small impressed mark in the paper itself, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. My father used a custom drafting stamp to mark his working surface before he began drawing. It was a small brass tool he made himself, and it pressed a shallow impression into the paper. A tiny gear wheel, no larger than a sixpence. He used it to identify his own work, the way a silversmith uses a hallmark. Every authentic drawing my father ever produced carries this mark. She held the sheet up to the window light. The impression was faintly visible, a small circular pattern pressed into the fibers of the paper. This mark is present on Lord Sterling's blueprints, Nora said, because these sheets of paper were taken from my father's own stock. The drawings on them were made later, over paper that my father had already stamped. The copyist used my father's own blank sheets to make the forgery more convincing, not realizing that the paper itself carried a signature they could not erase. She laid the sheet down and turned to face Sterling. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. The warmth was gone entirely. What remained was something flat and careful, the face of a man rapidly calculating his remaining options. Furthermore, Nora said, turning back to the magistrate, the ink used on these drawings is a common iron gall mixture, available from any stationer in London. My father mixed his own ink. He added a small quantity of lampblack to his iron gall solution, which gave his lines a slightly warmer tone than standard commercial ink. The drawings in Lord Sterling's portfolio are written in commercial ink on my father's paper. The conclusion is clear. These are forgeries, produced by someone who studied my father's methods, but did not understand all of them. Thornbury sat back in his chair. He looked at Sterling's documents, then at Nora's authenticated examples, then at the impressed gear mark on the back of the forged sheet. "Mr. Huxley," Thornbury said, "does your client wish to respond to this testimony?" Huxley leaned toward Sterling. There was a brief, whispered exchange. Sterling's jaw was tight, and his fingers, which had been so casually folded in his lap a quarter of an hour ago, were now gripping the edge of the bench. "My client reserves his right to respond at a later date, Your Honor." "Very well." Thornbury made a note on his papers. "Given the evidence presented by Miss Finch, I am ordering a full examination of the documents submitted by Lord Sterling. I am also issuing a preliminary finding in favor of the patent application filed on behalf of the late Thomas Finch, pending completion of the technical review." He looked over his spectacles at Sterling. "Lord Sterling, you are advised not to dispose of any documents or materials related to this matter until the court's examination is complete." Nora walked back to her bench and sat down. Her legs felt weak beneath her, and she pressed her hands flat against her knees to stop them from trembling. Beside her, Vance exhaled slowly, a long breath that she suspected he had been holding for the past 10 minutes. "Your father's gear mark," he said quietly. "You never mentioned it. You never asked." The corner of his mouth lifted. "Remind me never to underestimate you, Miss Finch." Across the room, Lord Sterling stood and walked toward the door. As he passed their bench, he paused for less than a second. His eyes met Nora's. There was no warmth in them now, no practiced charm, no easy smile. There was something cold and cornered, and Nora held his gaze until he looked away and walked out into the gray Westminster morning. The first battle was won. The war, she knew, was far from over. The court order arrived at Vance's London townhouse 3 days after the hearing. Nora was in the drawing room when Aldworth brought it in, still sealed with the court's red wax stamp. She had been reading through a stack of her father's early notebooks that she had retrieved from a trunk stored at the village vicarage in Hertfordshire. Journals filled with his careful handwriting and rough sketches dating back to the years before Nora was born. Every page was a conversation with a man she could no longer speak to, and she handled them the way one handles something sacred. Aldworth set the document on the table and adjusted his spectacles. Magistrate Thornbury has granted a search order for Lord Sterling's London residence. Based on Miss Finch's testimony and the evidence of forged documents, the court has authorized the seizure of any materials related to the steam pump design, including correspondence, financial records, and original engineering documents. Vance, who had been standing by the window reading a letter from his estate manager in Northumberland, set the letter aside. "When?" "This afternoon. The court has assigned 2 bailiffs to accompany us. Thornbury wants it done quickly, before Sterling has time to move anything." Nora closed her father's notebook. "Sterling has had 3 days since the hearing. If he is as careful as we think he is, he may have already destroyed whatever he was keeping." "Perhaps," Aldworth said. "But Thornbury placed a watch on Sterling's residence the night of the hearing. 2 men from the court-martial's office, stationed at the front and rear of the property. No large items have been removed. No carts, no trunks, no document cases." "He could have burned papers in his own fireplace," Nora said. "He could have. But a man like Sterling keeps records, detailed ones. His entire operation depends on documentation, contracts with solicitors, letters of arrangement, proof of the transactions he brokers. He cannot destroy everything without destroying the machinery that makes him money." Aldworth tapped the court order with his pen. "My professional opinion is that Sterling believes his forgeries were good enough to survive scrutiny. He did not expect your testimony, Miss Finch. He did not expect the gear mark, and he did not expect the court to move this fast. They left for Sterling's townhouse at 2:30. The carriage carried Nora, Vance, and Aldworth through the crowded streets of the West End, past the grand white-fronted houses of Belgravia, and into a quiet square near Eaton Place, where Sterling's residence occupied the largest corner plot. It was an imposing house, 4 stories of pale stone, with black iron railings and tall sash windows that reflected the dull afternoon sky like blind eyes. 2 bailiffs were waiting at the front steps, both solid men in dark coats, carrying leather satchels for collecting evidence. A third man, the court-martial's deputy, held the official search warrant and knocked on the front door with the flat confidence of someone who had done this many times. Sterling's butler answered. He was a gray-haired man with the rigid posture of someone who had spent 40 years maintaining the standards of a household and did not intend to stop now, regardless of what legal documents were being waved in his face. He read the warrant slowly, examined the court seal, and then stepped aside with a look that suggested he considered the entire affair deeply beneath the dignity of the house. The entrance hall was marble-floored, with a sweeping staircase and portraits in gilt frames lining the walls. Nora noticed the paintings as she passed, generations of Sterling ancestors, men in powdered wigs and military uniforms, women in elaborate gowns, wealth and position displayed like armor on every surface. Sterling was waiting for them in the library. It was a large, handsome room on the first floor, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books, arranged by color rather than subject, which told Nora they were for decoration and had probably never been opened. A fire burned in the marble fireplace, and Sterling stood beside it, in a dark blue jacket and cream waistcoat, looking as composed as if he were receiving afternoon callers. "Your Grace," Sterling said to Vance. His voice carried the same warm, measured tone Nora remembered from the ball. "Miss Finch, I must say, I did not expect the pleasure of your company so soon." "Lord Sterling," Aldworth said, stepping forward with the warrant. "This court order authorizes the search of your premises for documents and materials related to the patent dispute currently before Magistrate Thornbury. I would ask for your cooperation." Sterling took the warrant and read it without hurry. He folded it and handed it back. "By all means, Mr. Aldworth. Search wherever you wish. I have nothing to hide." The bailiffs began their work in the study across the hall, going through desk drawers, filing cabinets, and a large wooden bureau that contained years of household correspondence. Aldworth supervised them, making notes in a small leather book. Vance remained in the library with Sterling, and Nora could feel the tension between the two men filling the room like pressure in a sealed vessel. Nora stood in the center of the library and looked around. She was not interested in the books or the paintings or the expensive Turkish carpet beneath her feet. She was looking at the room the way her father had taught her to look at machines. Every mechanism has a purpose. Every component exists for a reason. If something looks decorative, look again, because someone may have wanted you to stop looking. The desk in the corner of the library was a large mahogany piece with brass fittings and a green leather writing surface. It had 6 visible drawers, 3 on each side, all of which the bailiffs would search in due course. Nora walked to it and ran her hand along the surface. She opened each drawer in turn. Stationery, blank correspondence cards, a silver letter opener, sealing wax. Nothing remarkable. She closed the last drawer and paused. The desk was deep. The drawers, when fully extended, did not reach the back panel. There was a gap of perhaps 4 inches between the rear of each drawer and the back of the desk. On a well-built piece of furniture, that space would be structural, needed for the joinery. But 4 inches was generous, more than a carpenter would need. Nora crouched down and examined the underside of the desk. The wood was smooth and continuous, except for a thin seam running across the bottom panel, roughly 6 inches from the back edge. She pressed along the seam with her fingertips and felt a slight give on the left side. "Mr. Aldworth," she said, "would you come here, please?" Aldworth crossed the room. Vance followed. Sterling remained by the fireplace, but Nora saw his hand, which had been resting casually on the mantelpiece, go very still. "There is a concealed compartment in this desk," Nora said. "The seam runs here, beneath the bottom panel. There is a release mechanism on the left side." Aldworth knelt beside her. He pressed where she indicated, and there was a faint click. A narrow drawer slid out from the back of the desk, hidden behind the decorative rear panel. It was no more than 2 inches deep and perhaps 18 inches wide, designed to be invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside the drawer was a leather journal, small and worn, bound with a strap and buckle. The leather was dark brown, stained with oil and use, and the edges of the pages were soft with age. Nora reached for it, and her hand stopped in the air above it. She knew this journal. She knew the scuff mark on the front cover where her father had dropped it in the workshop when she was 9 years old. She knew the small ink stain on the lower right corner where she had accidentally knocked over a bottle while doing her schoolwork at his bench. She knew the faint impression of a gear wheel stamped into the inside cover. the same mark that had exposed Sterling's forgeries in court 3 days ago. This was her father's original engineering journal, the one that had vanished from his workshop, along with everything else. The one that contained his earliest sketches of the steam pump, his calculations, his notes in the margins where he argued with himself about pressure ratios and valve timing. The record of 11 years of work, written in the hand of a man who loved what he built. Nora lifted the journal from the drawer and held it against her chest. "This is my father's," she said. Her voice was steady, which cost her more effort than anything she had done in the courtroom. "His name is written on the first page, Thomas Edward Finch, Hertfordshire, 1830. This is the original record of every design he ever created, including the steam pump." Aldworth took a careful note. One of the bailiffs stepped forward to catalogue the item. Across the room, Sterling had not moved from his position by the fireplace, but the color had gone from his face. He looked like a man watching a door close that he had always believed would stay open. "Lord Sterling," Aldworth said, "this journal will be entered into evidence and presented to Magistrate Thornbury. Combined with Miss Finch's prior testimony and the forensic analysis of the forged blueprints, I believe the court will have a comprehensive picture of events." Sterling said nothing. For the first time since Nora had met him at the Mayfair ball, the warm smile and the easy charm were entirely absent. What remained was a man standing very still in a beautiful room, surrounded by books he had never read and portraits of ancestors who would have recognized the expression on his face. It was the look of someone who had finally been caught. Nora held her father's journal and did not look at Sterling again. She did not need to. The leather was warm against her hands, and the weight of it was familiar, the exact weight she remembered from all those evenings, watching her father write by lamplight in his workshop, the fire crackling in the small stove, and the smell of metal and oil filling the room. She had promised herself, on the day she buried him in the churchyard at the edge of the village, that she would find what was taken, that she would bring his name back from the silence where it had been thrown. The journal was in her hands. His name was on the first page, and the man who had stolen it was standing 10 feet away with nothing left to say. The Royal Society Exhibition Hall on the Strand was the largest enclosed space Nora had ever stood inside. The ceiling was a vaulted expanse of iron and glass, built in the style of the great railway stations that were beginning to reshape London's skyline, and the morning light that came through the panels above was clean and bright in a way that felt almost foreign after months of working in dim workshops and candle-lit studies. The floor was polished stone, and the hall was divided into wide aisles by rows of wooden exhibition stands, each one displaying the latest achievements of British engineering, science, and manufacture. There were textile looms and telegraph instruments, medical devices and agricultural machinery, a scale model of a proposed suspension bridge, and a functioning clockwork automaton that could write its own name with a quill pen. And in the center of the hall, on a raised platform draped in dark cloth, stood her father's steam pump. The full-scale machine was magnificent. It stood 7 feet tall, its twin cylinders gleaming with fresh oil, the brass fittings polished until they caught the light from the glass ceiling and threw it back in warm flashes. The boiler sat at the base, a solid drum of quarter-inch steel plate, properly built this time, with the correct pressure ratings and a safety valve set exactly where Nora's specifications demanded. The flywheel was 4 feet across, its spokes cast in a single piece at the Greystock foundry under Nora's direct supervision after Crabbe had been quietly dismissed and replaced by a foreman whose loyalties were not for sale. Copper pipes connected the cylinders to the condenser, and a system of rods and linkages translated the piston motion into smooth rotary power at the drive shaft. It was, Nora thought, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and it looked exactly as her father had drawn it, 11 years ago, on a winter evening in a workshop that smelled of coal and iron filings. The hall was filling with guests. The Royal Society exhibition was the most prestigious scientific gathering in England, and invitations were guarded like state secrets. Nora could see clusters of men in academic robes, their society medals pinned to their chests, moving between the stands with the careful attention of people who understood what they were looking at. There were industrialists in expensive coats, members of parliament, newspaper correspondents with notebooks, and a scattering of military officers who had come to assess which inventions might serve the interests of the crown. Vance stood beside the platform, speaking with Sir Horace Pelham, the Society's president, a white-haired man with a booming voice and the kind of handshake that suggested he had once been a blacksmith rather than a scholar. The two men were discussing the afternoon program, and Nora caught fragments of their conversation as she checked the machine's fittings for the third time that morning. "The keynote demonstration is scheduled for 2 o'clock, Pelham was saying. "We have allocated 30 minutes for the presentation and a further 15 for questions from the membership. I understand Your Grace will be delivering the explanation?" "I will not," Vance said. Pelham's eyebrows rose. "I beg your pardon? Miss Finch will deliver the keynote. She is the daughter of the inventor and the engineer who supervised the construction of this machine. There is no one in this hall more qualified to explain how it works." Pelham looked across the platform to where Nora was tightening a brass coupling with a spanner, her sleeves pushed back and a smudge of grease on her right wrist. His expression traveled through several stages of surprise before arriving at something that might have been curiosity. "A woman delivering a keynote at the Royal Society exhibition," Pelham said. "That will be a first." "Then, it is overdue," Vance said, and the matter appeared to be settled. Nora learned of this arrangement approximately 45 minutes before she was expected to stand in front of 300 of the most distinguished minds in England and explain the operating principles of a twin-cylinder compound steam engine. "You might have mentioned this earlier," she said to Vance, standing behind the platform where the audience could not see the color draining from her face. "If I had told you last week, you would have spent 7 days finding reasons to refuse. This way, you only have 40 minutes to argue, which is not enough time for you to be properly stubborn about it." "I am not stubborn. You once spent an entire afternoon filing down a piston ring because it was 1/1000th of an inch wider than your specification. That is not stubbornness. That is precision." Vance handed her a folded piece of paper. "I wrote some notes for the introduction. You are welcome to ignore them entirely, which I suspect you will." Nora unfolded the paper. At the top, in Vance's clear handwriting, was a single line. "This machine was designed by Thomas Finch. His daughter will tell you how it works." She folded the paper again and put it in her pocket. At 2 o'clock, the hall quieted. The guests gathered around the central platform in a wide semicircle, and Sir Horace Pelham made a brief introduction that Nora barely heard over the sound of her own pulse. Then Pelham stepped aside, and Nora climbed the 3 wooden steps to the platform. 300 faces looked up at her. Scholars, lords, industrialists, soldiers, men who had spent their lives studying, building, investing, commanding. Men who had never seen a woman stand where she was standing now. Nora looked at the machine beside her. She put her hand on the warm brass of the main cylinder and felt the faint vibration of the water already heating in the boiler below. She thought of her father's workshop, the lamplight, the smell of ink and iron, the sound of his pencil moving across paper while she sat on the floor beside his bench, learning to read engineering drawings before she learned to read books. "This machine," she said, and her voice carried clearly across the hall, "was designed by my father, Thomas Edward Finch, over the course of 11 years. He was a foundry worker from Hertfordshire. He had no university education. He had no patron and no wealth. What he had was a problem that he could not stop thinking about, and the patience to solve it. She explained the twin-cylinder principle. She described how the two pistons worked in alternating sequence, one driving while the other recovered, producing a continuous and even output of power that single-cylinder engines could never achieve. She walked the audience through the valve timing system, the crossover mechanism, the governor that regulated speed under varying loads. She pointed to each component as she spoke, and the audience followed her hands, the way students follow a teacher's chalk across a blackboard. Then she lit the spirit lamp beneath the boiler. The hall went silent. 300 people watched as the pressure gauge began to climb. The water heated. Steam rose through the copper pipes into the first cylinder. The piston moved, smooth and sure, pushing the connecting rod that turned the crankshaft, that spun the flywheel. One cylinder fired, then the other, the alternating rhythm settling into the steady beat that Nora knew as well as her own heartbeat. The pump engaged, water drawn from a reservoir beneath the platform began to rise through a vertical pipe, climbing steadily until it poured from the outlet into a glass tank mounted on a stand 6 feet above the floor. The flow was strong and constant, without the surging and stalling that plagued every single-cylinder pump on the market. The machine ran perfectly, exactly as her father had designed it, exactly as she had built it. The applause began somewhere in the middle of the crowd and spread outward like a wave. It grew until it filled the vaulted hall, bouncing off the iron beams and the glass panels overhead. Nora stood beside her father's engine and let the sound wash over her, and she did not try to stop the tears that ran down her face, because there was no shame in them. She looked out across the crowd and found Vance. He was standing at the back of the semicircle, apart from the other guests, his hands clasped behind him. He was not applauding. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something quiet and unguarded that he probably did not know she could read from this distance. She held his gaze for a moment, then she turned back to the audience, wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, and spent the next 15 minutes answering questions from some of the finest scientific minds in England, and answering them well. Her father's name was in the record. His machine was running, and the sound it made, that steady, alternating rhythm of 2 cylinders working together, was the sound of a promise kept. Spring came to Blackwood Estate the way it always did in that part of England, slowly at first and then all at once, as if the countryside had been holding its breath through the long winter and finally decided to exhale. The hedgerows along the drive filled with white blossom. The fields beyond the stone walls turned from brown to pale green, and the sheep returned to the upper pastures, where the grass was sweetest. Birds nested in the eaves of the main house, and Mrs. Calder waged a daily campaign against them, with a broom and a vocabulary that would have scandalized a dock worker. Nora had been back at the estate for 3 weeks. The patent had been granted in full by the High Court, registered under the name of Thomas Edward Finch as sole inventor, with the Duke of Blackwood listed as commercial sponsor and manufacturing licensee. The ruling had been published in the London Gazette, and 2 engineering journals had written about the case, focusing as much on the dramatic courtroom testimony as on the technical achievement of the engine itself. 3 mining companies in the north had already placed orders for the first production models, and Vance's solicitor was negotiating licensing terms with a 4th. Lord Stirling had not fared as well. Magistrate Thornbury had referred the matter of the forged documents to the criminal courts, and Stirling's affairs were now under investigation by the Crown Solicitor's Office. His membership at 3 London clubs had been quietly suspended. His invitations to society events had dried up like a stream in August. The man who had stood in Vance's ballroom drinking champagne with the ease of someone who believed himself untouchable was now spending his days in consultation with barristers who charged by the quarter hour and offered no guarantees. Nora did not feel satisfaction at Sterling's downfall. She had expected to, had imagined it during the long months of preparation, had thought that watching the man who destroyed her father face consequences would fill the hollow space inside her chest. It did not. The hollow space was still there. It was simply quieter now, like a room where the door had finally been closed against a draft. What filled the days instead was work. Real work. The kind that had purpose and direction. Nora had set up a permanent workshop in the converted stable block at Blackwood, equipped with tools and materials purchased from the Guild in London. She was refining the pump design for production, adapting her father's original drawings for different mine depths and water volumes, creating a family of machines based on the same core principle. She worked from early morning until the light failed, and she was, for the first time in longer than she could remember, content. She was also, she had come to realize, in considerable difficulty regarding the Duke. The problem had crept up on her, the way mechanical wear creeps up on a well-used bearing. Gradually, invisibly, until one day the thing that had been running smoothly for months suddenly made a different sound. She caught herself looking for him when he was not in the room. She noticed when he laughed, which was more often now than when she had first arrived. A low, genuine sound that he seemed almost surprised by each time it escaped him. She remembered the weight of his hand on hers when he had helped her down from the carriage after the court hearing, and the way he had held on for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and the way she had let him. These were observations she filed away without examining too closely, the way one might note a crack in a wall and decide to look at it tomorrow. Tomorrow had been accumulating for weeks. On a Tuesday evening in late April, Vance sent word through Mrs. Calder that he would like Nora to walk with him before dinner. The message was characteristically brief and gave no reason for the request, which was characteristically Vance. Nora washed the machine oil from her hands, changed into a clean dress, and met him at the garden gate. They walked in comfortable silence along the path that led from the formal gardens, through the orchard where the apple trees were just beginning to bud, and up the long grassy slope to the cliffside overlook at the western edge of the estate. It was the highest point on the property, a flat shelf of rock and turf that jutted out above a steep drop to the valley below. From here you could see the entire estate spread out like a map. The house with its chimneys trailing thin smoke, the stable block, the rebuilt carriage house, the patchwork of fields running down to the river, and beyond it, the village where the church tower caught the last of the evening light. The sun was setting. The sky had turned the color of warm brass along the horizon, deepening to lavender, and then to the first faint blue of night directly overhead. The air smelled of grass and wood smoke, and a blackbird was singing, somewhere in the hedgerow behind them, repeating the same phrase over and over, as if trying to get it exactly right. Vance stopped at the edge of the overlook. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, looking out at the valley, and Nora stood beside him and waited, because she had learned that Vance said important things only after he had been quiet for a while. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his inside pocket and produced a folded document. Nora recognized it immediately. It was their marriage contract, the agreement Aldworth had drawn up in London during their second week, the one that laid out the terms of their arrangement in precise legal language. A marriage of convenience for the purpose of securing the patent. No obligations beyond the public presentation. A dissolution clause to be exercised by either party once the patent was granted. Vance held the document in both hands. Then, carefully and deliberately, he tore it in half. He tore the halves into quarters, and the quarters into smaller pieces, and he let the fragments fall from his fingers. The evening breeze caught them and carried them out over the cliff edge, spinning and tumbling down toward the valley like a flock of small white birds. Nora watched the pieces disappear. Her heart was doing something unreliable in her chest. "The patent is granted," Vance said. "Your father's name is on the record. Sterling is finished. Every condition of that contract has been fulfilled, which means the contract is no longer necessary." He turned to face her. "And I find that I do not want what comes next to have anything to do with conditions or contracts or legal arrangements drawn up by solicitors." He reached into his pocket again and brought out a small velvet box, dark blue and slightly worn at the edges, as if it had been carried around for some time by someone who kept checking to make sure it was still there. He opened it. Inside was a ring. It was not the kind of ring Nora had seen on the fingers of the society women at the Mayfair ball, those towering arrangements of diamonds and gold designed to be noticed from across a room. This was a simple band of white gold, set with a single small sapphire, the color of deep water. It was beautiful in the way that well-made things are beautiful, because every element of it served a purpose, and nothing was wasted. "I am not good at this," Vance said. "I have been practicing what to say for the better part of a week, and none of it sounds right, because the truth is simpler than anything I could rehearse." He paused. "I would like to marry you, Nora. I would like to marry you because you are the most extraordinary person I have ever known, and because the months I have spent beside you have been the best of my life, and because I cannot imagine building anything worth building without you standing next to me, telling me my measurements are wrong." Nora laughed. It came out before she could stop it, a real laugh that startled the blackbird into silence. "Your measurements are frequently wrong," she said. "I know, that is why I need you." He held out the ring. "This is not an arrangement. This is not a transaction. I am asking you, as myself, with nothing attached to it except the fact that I love you, and I think you might love me, and I would very much like to find out what happens if we stop pretending otherwise." The sun was almost gone. The last light lay along the horizon in a thin line of gold, and the first stars were appearing above the darkening hills. The valley below was filling with shadow, and the windows of the house in the distance were beginning to glow with lamplight, one by one, like a household preparing for someone to come home. Nora looked at the ring. She looked at Vance. She thought of her father, who had spent his life building things that worked, things that held together under pressure, because every part was in its right place. She thought of the night she had walked into this man's study, with a stolen candle and a desperate plan, and how everything since then had been leading, through fire and courtrooms and forgery, and the steady rhythm of two cylinders working together, to this exact moment, on this exact cliff, with this exact man, holding a small blue box, and looking at her as if she were the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. "Yes," she said. Vance slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, which did not surprise her, because she suspected he had measured her hand at some point during the past 5 months, using the same calipers she kept in the workshop, and she had simply chosen not to notice. He kissed her. It was gentle and unhurried, the kind of kiss that suggested they had all the time in the world, which, standing on the edge of that cliff, with the sky darkening above them and the estate spread out below, it rather felt like they did. The blackbird started singing again. The stars came out, and Nora Finch, daughter of a foundry worker from Hertfordshire, stood beside the man she loved on the grounds of the life she had built, and felt, for the first time, that every broken thing had been made whole.